Genetically engineered crops could be grown here after Brexit if the government agrees to amend the agriculture bill. The chair of the all-party parliamentary committee on science and technology in agriculture, the Conservative MP Julian Sturdy, has written to the DEFRA secretary pushing for the agriculture bill to be changed to allow a minister to decide on the way GE technology is governed. Under EU rules, genetically edited and genetically modified crops are subject to the same restrictions. Some scientists, plant breeders and farmers say gene editing should be treated differently, as the changes it makes to DNA could happen naturally or through conventional breeding. Well, the British government argued against the EU ruling when it was introduced, and Mr Sturdy says exempting GE technology from GM rules after Brexit would allow step-change improvements in crops.
It's basically an amendment that's going to be put down in the Lords. This is about single gene editing applications, so it's sort of very minor modifications under genome technology, but it can make a huge difference. We've got a great group of scientists who are backing this, and it's a way of tackling sort of food security, food waste, climate change, global inequality, and a lot of these scientists are wanting this technology because they want to access the same tools as their counterparts around the world to try and tackle a lot of these issues that are on the table.
It is still, though, quite controversial and of course has been banned by the EU. And what you're proposing is that a minister would be able to consult and then decide on this. Isn't this something that should be debated by all MPs, not just a decision by one minister?
If we get the amendment down in the Lords to the agricultural bill, it will be debated in the Lords and then it would come back to the Commons, so it would get this opportunity to be debated. But actually we've got a huge amount of support for this within the Lords, cross-party support and cross-party support in the Commons. So there is no doubt about it. Momentum is sort of gathering pace on this. And I very much hope the government will listen to this and be able to either support the amendment if it's tabled in the Lords, or even, better will be to table their own amendment to the agricultural bill.
Some might suggest, though, that it might be better to discuss something like this in its own bill, which would deal with genetic engineering and genetic modification and discuss it more widely, rather than, as some might see it, a slightly fudgy way of then giving the decision to an agriculture minister in the future.
The agricultural bill gives us a huge opportunity to raise this issue and bring it forward. So my argument is that if within the agricultural bill, this is the first time we've seen a piece of legislation like this for decades. This is the time to debate it, and this is the time to put it forward in legislation. And we've got to remember, this isn't around the world. This kind of gene editing is not classed as GM, so it's very minor single gene editing, and this is the whole point of it, is not whether it's GM or not. It's the fact that actually this is minor gene editing and can make a huge difference to science across the world. And I think if we can get this moving forward, we will see huge benefits not only in the UK but around the world. When we're talking about climate change, global inequality, we're talking about drought tolerance wheat, maize, potatoes that could be blight resistant. You're talking about a huge reduction in chemical applications, which has big environmental impact. So it could be a real game changer, could this?
Conservative MP and arable farmer Julian Sturdy. Well, Liz O'Neill from the campaign group GM Freeze told me she's concerned that this amendment, if passed, would sidestep parliamentary scrutiny.
Well, I have to say the first thing that worries me is that what's been proposed is giving power to the minister to decide what counts as GM. Now, that's not us taking back control. It's the politicians of the day having free rein to make hugely influential decisions without proper scrutiny. I know that they've mentioned consultation, but if the nature of the consultation isn't defined, then there's very limited scrutiny on that, and it could go in any direction that a minister decides in the future.
Although Julian Sturdy is very clear, this is about genetic engineering, what he would describe as small changes that actually do occur in nature and could occur through natural breeding, just faster and more targeted. And that, he says, is a technology that we need, and we should be able, as they do in other countries, to have it.
Yeah, I mean, playing games with the terminology is just kind of playground stuff.
Some people call it playing games with the terminology. He's pretty clear on what he wants.
Yes, he's clear on what he wants, but referring to one thing as engineering and another thing as modification is just playing with the words. What we understand they're targeting is what they describe as simple genome edits. But there's no meaningful distinction between simple and complex genome edits. Even if you are looking at very small mutations, that doesn't mean that the impacts are going to be small. If you take an example from human health, sickle cell anemia, which is devastating, is caused by a single point mutation. So that's one nucleotide change can cause a disease that devastates generations of a family. So just because something may look simple at the molecular level, it doesn't mean that the impacts that it's going to have are small or controlled in any way. If you're changing the DNA, then it needs to be regulated. And we need to remember that regulation is a safeguard, not a ban.
Although what Mr. Sturdy will argue is that there is a momentum building now among scientists, among plant breeders, to an extent among farmers as well. And they want to take advantage of this technology, and leaving the EU gives them the opportunity to do that.
Well, leaving the EU changes a lot of things, but what it doesn't change is the need to trade with EU countries. And if the UK has a different definition of GM to our EU partners, then there's going to be a serious barrier to trade there. And even within the UK, the devolved nations could choose not to adopt any new definition that a Westminster minister goes with, because agriculture is a devolved competency, and all three of the UK's devolved nations have a different policy approach to GM. So there you could be talking about a farm, or farms on either side of the border between Scotland and England, or England and Wales, having different rules about what counts as GM. That would be absolute chaos.
Liz O'Neill from GM Freeze. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The studio manager is Nick Ford, and the producer in Bristol is Beatrice Fenton.
Now on BBC Radio for Tweet of the Day, Martin Hughes Games presents The Marsh Tit.
The loud pichoo call of the marsh tit is a welcome but less commonly heard sound in many woodlands. The marsh tit is badly named. It doesn't live in marshes, and it's most at home in older, broadleaf woodlands. Oak tit might be a better name. Because marsh tits don't have the bright colours and striking patterns of blue or great tits, it's easy to overlook them. But when you hear that call, like a discreet sneeze, you can pick them out as they flit through the branches. Then you can appreciate their subtle fawn grey plumage, white cheeks and black cap and bibs. But be warned, that's also a good description of the very similar willow tit. So it's safer to rely on the pichoo call as your guide. You'll find marsh tits throughout England and Wales, but they're absent as breeding birds from Ireland and most of Scotland. And unlike some other tit species, they don't travel far. In fact, they're one of the most stay-at-home birds in the UK, holding and defending their woodland territories throughout the winter.
And you can hear all the episodes from Tweet of the Day on the BBC Sounds app. This is BBC Radio 4.
It's 6 o'clock on Friday, the 22nd of May. Good morning. This is Today with Michelle Hussain and Justin Webb.
The headlines this morning. Care home providers have called again for routine retesting for coronavirus to prevent further deadly outbreaks. We'll hear from the boss of one of the country's largest chains and the government's testing czar. Government plans to quarantine travellers arriving in the UK from next month are expected to introduce spot checks and fines to ensure people self-isolate. Also in today's programme, sedition, succession and treason all set to be outlawed in Hong Kong as China imposes new laws. A U-turn on NHS fees for foreigners working in the health system. We break the news to one care worker.
Oh, I cannot contain my enjoyment right now. I could hug everybody right now, but 2 meters hug, yeah?
And? How Well, St Paul's Cathedral is beginning work on a memorial for those who've died from coronavirus. The BBC News is read by Caroline Nichols.
Care home providers are calling for repeat testing of residents and staff to be made routine to help avoid further outbreaks of COVID-19 in the sector. Figures should suggest more than 11,500 people have died from coronavirus in care homes across the UK since the start of the pandemic. Currently, the government will only carry out retesting in care homes if there's a new outbreak. Sandra Berg reports.
In England, testing of all residents and staff is now underway, welcomed by care home owners. But they're worried the virus could easily return. Partial results from the testing pilot run last week show that out of 28 homes run by the provider MHA, 20 had at least one person who tested positive but without symptoms. MHA say this shows the need for regular repeat testing in care homes, something supported by others in the sector. The Department for Health and Social Care said retesting would be guided by clinical advice and available testing capacity.
The government's plans to quarantine travellers arriving in the UK from next month are expected to include police spot checks on those self-isolating and fines of up to £1,000 for not complying. It's thought the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, will give further details this afternoon. Airlines have warned quarantine measures will further damage their industry. Here's our political correspondent, Jessica Parker.
It's understood that anyone entering the UK will be told to self-isolate for 14 days and asked for contact information. The authorities could then carry out spot checks at private addresses, with those breaking the rules possibly facing a £1,000 fine. However, there will be exemptions for road hauliers and medical workers coming here to help tackle coronavirus, and for people from within the common travel area, which includes the Republic of Ireland and the Channel Islands. Senior government sources say that when domestic transmission rates were higher, quarantine measures would have had little impact. They argue now rates are lower, it can help stop a second wave of infections.
Researchers are beginning a trial of an immunotherapy treatment that could help the recovery of people with the most severe form of COVID-19. The patients have extremely low numbers of what are known as T cells, which clear infection from the body. Here's our science correspondent, Victoria Gill.
For an unlucky minority, COVID-19 is a debilitating disease and one with no specific treatment. But an examination of blood samples from 60 of the most severely ill patients has revealed a vital clue as to why some have worse symptoms than others. Those samples showed an extremely low number of a specific virus-fighting immune cell called a T cell. A team from Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London is now embarking on a clinical trial testing a new immune-boosting therapy called IL-7. It's already proven to increase the number of T cells that COVID-19 appears to deplete.
A BBC survey of councils in England has found almost 70 local authorities can't guarantee that primary schools will begin to reopen on the 1st of June. The date remains the Westminster government's stated ambition to resume classes for reception Year 1 and Year 6 pupils. 20 councils said they would be ready. A member of the government's scientific advisory group, SAGE, has suggested that ministers should have acted sooner to tackle the coronavirus outbreak. Professor Sir Ian Boyd said earlier intervention would have made quite a big difference to the death rate. He also told the BBC's coronavirus newscast that ministers should stop saying they were led by the science.
I think the statement, "we're guided by the science," is slightly misleading. I don't think ministers intend it to be misleading. What we in the scientific community do is give the best advice we can based on the evidence that's available to us. We then pass that to government ministers and the policy parts of government, who can then take that and do with it what they like.
Nearly 3,000 delegates from across China have gathered for the annual session of Parliament in Beijing. The meeting was postponed in March because of the coronavirus outbreak. A new security law that's likely to be passed has been fiercely criticised by pro-democracy groups in Hong Kong. The legislation is a response to months of sometimes violent protests in the territory and could see demonstrators charged with treason. President Trump has warned that the US would react strongly if the proposals were followed through. St Paul's Cathedral in London is launching an online memorial for people who lost their lives after testing positive for COVID-19. The virtual Book of Remembrance has been backed by the Prince of Wales following his recovery from the virus. The Dean of St Paul's, the Very Reverend David Eisen, said he hoped the initiative would give people somewhere to anchor their grief.
Having an online book where you can put that person alongside others, but you can go back to it, you can see them there, and you know that a place like St Paul's is going to hold that, hopefully for centuries, so that they are not forgotten, they are being held. That's a great comfort. You can't make it better for people in their grief, but you can be alongside them.
The Very Reverend David Ison.
Thank you. Brings us to 6 minutes past 6. Time for our first look at the weather. It comes from Sarah Keith-Lucas at the BBC Weather Centre this morning. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, good morning to you, Justin. Well, yesterday we saw temperatures up to 28 degrees, but a real change is on the cards today. Things are turning much more unsettled, much cooler and windier as well, and we've got some heavy rain on the way across the northwest of the UK, but the largely dry conditions are set to hold on in the south. So today, for the southeast of England and eastern England, it is a very mild and a cloudy start. We've got a few showers around. The cloud and the showery rain clear away towards the east over the next few hours, and then it's sunny, dry but breezy through the rest of the day, with highs around 22 degrees. For the southwest of England, the Midlands, Wales, all of northern England and Northern Ireland, it's said to be a day of sunshine and blustery showers, and it will be particularly windy for parts of North Wales and Northern Ireland too. Gusts here could reach around 60 miles per hour, so some disruptive winds possible at times today. Most of the showers will be for Northern Ireland, Northwest England and North Wales. Fewer the further south and east you go. Cooler than recent days, temperatures around 18 to 20 degrees. And for Scotland today, we start with a weather front bringing some fairly persistent rain to central and northern parts of Scotland. That will shift its way northeastwards through the day, followed by sunny spells and heavy blustery showers, some strong and gusty winds, especially across western Scotland too. Temperatures around 17 degrees or so today. And the weekend, sunshine and heavy showers on Saturday, less windy and a little warmer by Sunday.
Sarah, thank you. 7 minutes past 6 is the time. Let's have a quick look at the papers and the front page of The Guardian. Still very keen on the story that's been rumbling for so long and upon which there was such a big change yesterday. This is the surcharge for foreign NHS workers, the U-turn. The first major U-turn, The Guardian says, of the Prime Minister's presidency, the Prime Minister's premiership, is still its front page lead story. It faced escalating pressure, The Guardian says, from his own ranks after Keir Starmer raised the issue in the Commons. Tory MPs and peer telling Johnson that the policy was mean-spirited and immoral, and the prospect of a humiliating rebellion facing him as well. A much more positive news for the Prime Minister on the front page of the Daily Mail. 2 testing breakthroughs unveiled last night to dramatically boost hopes of getting the UK moving. This is the on-the-spot test to tell patients if they have the virus in just 20 minutes, and an antibody test as well that could come in the next few days or weeks. The Telegraph, meanwhile, on its front page, is interested in this business of quarantine, and as we were hearing in the news, the police being given the power to carry out spot checks at homes, impose £1,000 fines if people don't obey the quarantine measures, which the Telegraph says are expected to be outlined today.
The Times focuses on that rollout of the antibody test. Immunity forms planned for coronavirus survivors. It says immunity certificates to free people from social distancing are being considered again, although the Times points out that it will be months before it's known whether those who have recovered retain immunity. And the Times' Science editor Tom Whipple writes that there are some diseases that your body forgets almost instantly. Virologists have their theories about the reasons for this. It seems that for some viruses, our immune systems simply do not think it is worth devoting the resources to maintain protection, and that makes it hard to interpret the results of coronavirus antibody tests, and in particular whether the controversial immunity passports idea should be pursued. For the Financial Times, one of the main stories, the story on its front page, and this comes after Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, has suggested that a further cut in the current 0.1% interest rate was under active review. The banks have hit out against the prospect of negative interest rates, says the FT, saying that the policy would slash their earnings and limit their ability to absorb an expected torrent of coronavirus-related loan losses.
It is 10 past 6. China is going to push through a sweeping set of security laws for Hong Kong, a move that critics say is going to end the territory's autonomy. Stephen McDonald is our correspondent there. Just tell us first of all, Stephen, what is planned and then what the reaction's been.
So it's interesting. This is being put through the National People's Congress. That's the annual session of Parliament. A new piece of legislation has been introduced And I'm not sure if they did this just thinking that due to the coronavirus, there wouldn't be so much attention given to the process. I mean, like, for example, where I'm standing right now, I'm in a little park. There are kids playing badminton. Some of them are on skateboards. Half the people don't have their face masks on anymore. And you can tell that life here is every day moving closer and closer towards something like normality, giving the authorities, frankly, a pretty good coronavirus recovery story to tell at this Congress. And yet, all of this is being overshadowed by this provision which would, impose a law on Hong Kong, a national security law, and it would, in effect, mean that, since last summer's rebellion kicked off there have been more than 7,000 protesters charged. And they're being charged for things like assembly-related matters or even for rioting. Well, instead, they face a new law accusing them of subversion, of secession, of treason. Now, these crimes are obviously much more serious and would carry a much more heavy penalty. And they've tried to bring such a law through the sort of local government there, the LegCo, unsuccessfully because it's been so unpopular. There were enormous street protests which stopped the law coming through. So the national government has decided, you know what, we're just going to bypass the LegCo. We're going to introduce this new law and we're going to stick it into Hong Kong's mini-constitution, thereby imposing it on everyone.
And is it fair to say, Stephen, that there is nothing anyone can do to stop it?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who follows Chinese politics will know that this is a rubber stamp process at the National People's Congress. It will go through with no opposition at all, I would imagine. Then all that has to happen is it goes to a sort of standing committee process in the coming months, and it could be law by August.
Stephen McDonald in Hong Kong, thank you very much, and it's something we'll come back to during the course of the programme.
It's now 13 minutes past 6, time for one of our regular snapshots of how different parts of the country have been impacted by coronavirus. Today it's with Simon Gilbert, political reporter for BBC Coventry and Warwickshire.
Coventry was once famously described as a ghost town, but more recently it's been gearing up to be a host town. The city will be the UK City of Culture in 2021, but years of planning for its moment in the spotlight now appear to hang in the balance. Almost 1 million people live in Coventry and the surrounding rural county of Warwickshire, a region hit by more than 2,000 COVID-19 related deaths. Coventry South MP Zara Sultana has been vocal on the disproportionate impact the virus seems to be having on ethnic minorities. She suggests it reflects wider social inequalities. There are also economic worries here. Warwickshire, unlike Coventry, operates a two-tier system of local government, and many of those lower-tier authorities are struggling to balance the books. The leader of Stratford District Council recently went as far as to say his authority would not survive without more government support. The home of William Shakespeare used to be heavily financed by tourists, but, alas, that's not to be the case this year. There are some signs of normality returning. Jaguar Land Rover, which has its global headquarters in Coventry, is preparing to welcome more workers back, and coffee shops are serving again. Today's community can take inspiration from their ancestors who overcame the Coventry Blitz to rebuild the city, and they're already doing what they can to make a difference. A burglary on a local food bank prompted the city's people to embody the most famous Coventrian of them all, Lady Godiva. They rode to the defence of the poor by donating thousands of pounds worth of food and cash. It was hoped the UK City of Culture title would bring people in the region together in 2021. Now, being together seems more important than ever. It could be one hell of a party.
Simon Gilbert there in Coventry. Now, despite the worsening unemployment situation, some parts of the UK, it seems, have seen an increase in vacancies in recent weeks. So, Rob Young has more on that and the rest of the business news. Morning, Rob.
Morning. Yeah, new data suggests there's been a rise in jobs being advertised in some rural communities. We will ask why. Also, over the next quarter of an hour, we'll look at how much the government may end up borrowing to pay for its coronavirus support programmes. And we'll talk to the boss of an energy company that's turning the usual customer-supplier relationship on its head by offering to pay households to use electricity. Well, we know the number of people claiming unemployment benefits has gone up and may well continue rising. The level of job ads gives us a good idea where the economy may be headed. Official data earlier this week showed that vacancies were down by a fifth in the 3 months to April. Well, the recruitment industry has started monitoring job ads every week and has found that some rural areas have seen a rise in vacancies. We can talk to Neil Carberry, who's the Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Morning, Neil.
Good morning.
So overall then, how many jobs were advertised last week and how does that compare to a regular week?
So what we do is we look across all of the job sites and do a count there. We think about 950,000 jobs were advertised in the last week. That's quite significantly down from normal and across the country in most areas, as you would expect, given the economic slowdown that we've experienced. There's been a big drop, but what we are just beginning to see, perhaps, is that in one or two areas, things are starting to change.
We'll come to those brighter areas in just a moment, but are you, when you look at the data from week to week, seeing that the worst is over, or is the trend overall still downwards?
The trend is still downwards at the moment, but certainly what we're picking up from recruiters across the country is that things stopped getting worse about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and things are just beginning to gently get better. So one of the reasons we're doing this jobs recovery tracker is, I think over the next few weeks, as the economy starts to open up, we'll see job postings start to pick up. But I think we'll also see them start to change as the economy reacts to everything that's going on.
So which parts of the economy then are stepping up recruitment, and why do you think rural areas in particular?
Well, I think there's two things happening in rural areas, and if you look at the list of areas of the country that have seen an increase, as diverse as Oman, Fermanagh in Northern Ireland, through to Murray in Scotland, Breckland in South Norfolk in England, what unifies them, I think, is strong rural economies in terms of things like agriculture and food processing. And of course, we're just coming into that time of the year where we saw the Pick for Britain campaign launched earlier in the week. There is a demand there, so that's perhaps not a surprise. But the biggest single area of growth of demand in the last week in growth of jobs postings is still health professionals. And we do wonder whether there's a trend here that some of the health and care jobs are a little bit more difficult to fill in those rural areas than they are in the cities. So maybe it's just taking a bit longer to get those filled.
And briefly, when do you think you will see an overall increase in job vacancies?
Well, we're just starting to see some trends. Roofers are up in this weekly data, and that's as sort of home maintenance goes back. So we'd anticipate over the next few weeks, there'd be quite a strong move in some of the sectors that are opening up. North East done well, and I think that's about manufacturing going back, as we were just hearing from your Coventry correspondent.
Thank you, Neil. Neil Carberry there from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Later this morning, we're going to get an official update on the state of the public finances. The government is taking on huge amounts of debt to pay for the various coronavirus support schemes, and that could mean borrowing this year ends up 6 or 7 times what was planned before the pandemic. Darshini David reports.
What Ella Round Presto's bakery normally sounds like, as it churns out sugar-free cakes mainly for restaurants and cafe chains. While they're shut, the government's job retention scheme has helped keep her in business and the ovens running.
I think it's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Because we don't have enough production in the factory to keep everybody in. So we furloughed some of them, brought some back, and then furloughed another bit of them and brought other ones back.
That scheme is paying the wages of over 8 million people, costing over £11 billion so far. Like other programmes, it's a lifeline.
I could invite Nightingale's head of nursing, Natalie Gray, on my behalf to unveil the plaque to declare NHS Nightingale Hospital open.
Add in the cost of new hospitals and less tax coming in, and the shortfall, the deficit between what the government gets and spends has ballooned. It was previously estimated at £55 billion. Now it could be £300 billion, or even more. The government has three options to fill the gap: raise more money through taxes, spend less, or borrow. With austerity out of fashion, Torsten Bell, chief executive of the Resolution Foundation, thinks tax rises are inevitable. Eventually.
The big questions we look through the 2020s will be how much and which taxes to put up. That's partly to pay for getting the deficit down after coronavirus, but actually it's also because we're an ageing society, and that in the end means a bigger state.
So the option is therefore to start tapping all of us for more cash in the form of tax rises. And where do you see, frankly, the spotlight turning there?
If you think about some higher earners, they may even be drawing their full salary while working from home and actually saving more than they've ever saved before. If you're not paying for a season ticket on the train, then your costs have gone down.
That may wait until the depth of the crisis has passed. For now, the government's relying on borrowing from the money markets in the form of bonds or IOUs to investors. As it's never missed a repayment, they see the UK government as a safe bet. Yet, it's now borrowing 4 times as much as a year ago. Has it gone too far? Jeremy Stretch is head of strategy at the bank CIBC.
Clearly, when we're talking about a potential budget deficit this year of maybe running up towards 15% of GDP, you would normally, under normal circumstances, regard that as an absolute crisis scenario, and you would see investors really balking at that sort of level of imbalance. It isn't something that is unique to the UK, and of course we are seeing significant levels of monetary expansion from central bank balance sheets.
As the Bank of England is effectively underpinning those bonds, he's feeling pretty relaxed. But there is a limit to how much debt we should take on. The repayments already cost more than what we spend on schools or defence. Ultimately, tax rises are looming. Back to Ella Round-Prestos.
I'm terrified. Basically, the government is paying people not to work. It can't be a long-term solution. At some point, somebody's going to have to pay that bill.
The challenge for the Chancellor is how and when to bring those tax hikes in without risking a recovery falling flat.
Darshini David reporting there. Let's talk to our markets guest this morning, Tom Stevenson, the Investment Director at Fidelity International. Morning, Tom.
Good morning.
Banks have said they're unhappy at the prospect of negative interest rates in the UK. We were talking about this yesterday morning. Why do rates below zero hurt banks in particular?
Well, I mean, in very simple terms, the profitability of a bank is determined by the gap between what they charge to people borrowing money from them and what they pay to depositors. Now, in normal circumstances, when interest rates are 3 or 4 or 5%, then it's quite easy to have a meaningful gap between those two figures. As rates come down towards zero and into negative territory, it actually becomes very difficult, because it's difficult to actually charge people to deposit their money with you. So banks get squeezed, and their profitability becomes much more difficult at those sorts of levels.
Well, shareholders in Lloyds have got a problem with the company's executive pay policy. More than a third of investors voted against the bank, even though it has cut pay for its top bosses. So what is this row about?
Yes, I mean, the row is not so much about the level of the pay as the terms on which that pay is earned. So the top bosses will probably earn less. Antonio Horta Osorio can probably earn now a maximum package of 6.3 million, down from 8.3 million previously. But what shareholders are concerned about is that the conditions which apply to determine what he actually receives have been made much easier. So the probability of him getting that figure is much greater now.
Overnight, we heard from the Chinese government. It said it will no longer target a certain level of annual economic growth, which it has done so for a very long time. So what do you think that might tell us about what's likely to happen in the world's second biggest economy over the next year?
Yes, I think this is quite an interesting development, because to an extent, having this target has sort of hung around China's neck for many years, because it forced it to drive through growth at any price, if you like, and so it's encouraged spending on activities which are really not that productive, the kind of bridges to nowhere sort of mentality. So I think that what China is going to do now will be to focus more on the quality of its growth rather than the quantity.
Thank you, Tom. Tom Stevenson there from Fidelity. There's been a sharp fall in demand for electricity since the coronavirus measures were introduced in March. Well, this bank holiday weekend has expected our energy use will fall even further. In an attempt to boost demand, customers of the renewable energy supplier Octopus are being told they'll be paid to use power during certain times on Sunday. I asked the company's chief executive, Greg Jackson, how much money he'll be giving his customers.
We'll be paying them around 2 pence per kilowatt hour for a couple of hours in the morning and a couple of hours in the afternoon if they've got an eligible smart meter and opt into the programme.
So how much could somebody earn then if they decided to run their dishwasher, their washing machine, they did all the ironing, whatever else?
Yeah, it's not a lot, right? I think the key thing to note here is that typically a UK household spends about 10 pence per hour on electricity, and here we're actually going to be paying them to use it. So, you might think of it a bit more like the carrier bag tax, where just that 5 pence change completely altered how we shop and made it much better for the environment. It's the same here. If we can start seeing green electricity when it's abundant as being extra cheap electricity, even negatively priced, then we can deliver the renewable revolution faster and cheaper.
So where do you get the money from then to then pass on to your customers?
So the way the electricity system works is National Grid need to make sure at all times that they're generating the same amount that customers are using. Traditionally, when they're generating too much, they turn generators off, and that costs money. So instead of paying generators to turn off and the cost of that, we can pay customers to use those green electrons when they're available. The great news is that means that they'll be using fewer brown electrons, and therefore the overall impact is to make a greener grid. It's cheaper for customers, and it'll let us move to renewable electricity system faster and cheaper.
So when there is, in a sense, excess electricity on the grid, you are being paid by the grid to take that electricity off the grid's hands.
That's right. I think there are times now, quite often during the COVID crisis, electricity demand is about 20% below normal, and National Grid quite frequently now is paying generators to turn off.
Isn't this potentially going to confuse customers? Because we've been told for years and years that we should conserve energy, and here you are telling your customers for a certain period of time, not a limited period of time, that they could, in a sense, waste electricity and be paid for it.
We've got to move to a world where what we're seeing here is customers will use it when it's greener, and they'll use less when it's brown. So it's just a case of moving away from dirty electricity and towards clean electricity. I think that's a good thing.
But we do need an element of gas-fired power, don't we, to keep the grid stable because of the inherent instability in solar and wind?
We do today, but the change to electric vehicles is going to change all this. A typical electric car can hold as much electricity as a house will use in several days, maybe even a week. So as we move to more and more electric vehicles, we're literally going to have, up to a week's backup sitting in our driveways. As we move towards a renewable system, there will be times when we've got less available. There'll always be enough. You just have to pay more for it.
Are you saying that in future, if we have an awful lot more, perhaps maybe all, of our energy coming from green sources, that it will be a more precarious supply?
No, it won't be more precarious. Instead, what it will be is a world in which we're just more aware through pricing of the best and worst times to use it, the greenest times and least green times.
Greg Jackson of Octopus Energy.
Thank you very much, Rob. The time is now 29 minutes past 6, and let's look ahead to next week here on Radio 4.
Every time someone spoke, the scenarios seemed to be getting worse and worse.
How the post office stands accused of causing a scandal.
I prepared myself for the worst.
I was worse than really annoyed. I was utterly shocked.
The postmasters who fought for years to get heard in a courtroom.
The whole point of the case, not only should they never have done what they've done to people, they should never be allowed to do it again, ever.
Join me, Nick Wallace, for the Great Post Office Trial on BBC Radio 4. Next Monday to Friday afternoon at 1:45.
Time now is exactly 6:30. You're listening to Today on Radio 4, Michelle Hussain and Justin Webb and Caroline Nichols with the news.
Care home providers are calling for repeat testing of residents and staff to be made routine to help avoid further coronavirus outbreaks in the sector. Early results from a government pilot found that in more than 2/3 of care homes where everyone was tested, at least one person who wasn't displaying any symptoms was found to have the virus. There are fears such an individual could unwittingly go on to reinfect the whole home. Currently, the government will only carry out retesting in care homes where there's known to be a new outbreak. Travellers entering the UK could face spot checks by the police and fines of £1,000 once new quarantine rules come into force next month. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is expected to set out further details of the scheme later today, which will require people arriving from abroad to self-isolate for a fortnight. It's aimed at preventing a second wave of infections. Researchers are trialling a new treatment for COVID-19 that targets the immune system. A team from Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London has found that those with the most serious form of the disease have extremely depleted numbers of what are known as T cells, which usually clear infection from the body. The experimental form of immunotherapy aims to boost T cell production. A BBC survey of councils in England has found almost 70 local authorities can't guarantee that primary schools will begin to reopen on the 1st of June. The date remains the Westminster government's stated ambition to resume classes for reception Year 1 and Year 6 pupils. 20 councils said they would be ready. China is expected to unveil a new national security law for Hong Kong this morning, which looks set to limit constitutional freedoms. The law is likely to be hugely controversial in the territory, where pro-democracy activists held hundreds of rallies last year. St Paul's Cathedral in London is launching an online memorial for people who've died after testing positive for COVID-19. The virtual Book of Remembrance has been backed by the Prince of Wales, who himself fell ill from the virus.
Thank you. 28 minutes to 7 is the time. The government confirms today what they told us last week, that they are planning significant penalties if the self-isolation imposed on returning holidaymakers and travellers is not observed. Jonathan Blake is our political correspondent. Do we know when it's going to be imposed, Jonathan, and what exactly the plans are?
Next month at the earliest, because the plans have to go before Parliament, but they are, it seems, fully formed and ready to go. So anyone coming into the UK from overseas will be asked for their contact details and then told to self-isolate for 14 days. There are a few exceptions: road hauliers, those coming into work in the NHS, and people arriving from the common travel area, so that includes the Republic of Ireland and the Channel Islands. And it does also include British people arriving from abroad, who will also be asked to isolate. But aside from those exemptions, this is a blanket rule, and there will be spot checks, we're told, on private addresses. So those who don't comply with the request to go into self-isolation could face a possible fine of up to £1,000.
Yeah, and that, Michael O'Leary was telling us last week in quite trenchant terms, was crazy and just wouldn't work. But the government plainly think that it could, and that enough people will follow these rules for them to be worthwhile.
Yes, I mean, there is a worry about the impact that this will have on the travel industry. Airlines have warned that it could be catastrophic for them, and it is a pretty blunt tool, but it's one that other countries have introduced, and as you say, it's one that ministers clearly believe at this point is worth implementing, despite the impact that it could have. As to why it wasn't introduced sooner, as other countries have done so, well, ministers make the argument that earlier on, when infection rates were higher, it wouldn't have made too much of a difference to have some more cases arriving in the UK. But now, as that infection rate has dropped, it's a much more proportionately lower number of cases, and one way to help keep the infection rate down.
And they're willing to deal, are they, with the diplomatic fallout? So with France, with whom apparently there was going to be some sort of a deal done where they wouldn't be involved, that doesn't seem to have happened. And with Australia, I see Australia saying, actually, we've hardly got any coronavirus in our country, so why keep our citizens involved in this?
Yes, I mean, there's been discussions going on about whether certain countries should have exceptions, and there is clearly a nervousness, I think, in parts of government about the message this sends, aside from the direct economic impact it will have. And that's perhaps one reason we heard the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, talking earlier in the week about the possibility of those so-called air bridges, so exceptions for countries where there was a relatively low risk and a relatively low number of coronavirus cases. But at this stage, at least, the decision has been taken to apply it to all countries outside of the common travel area. It will, though, be reviewed every 3 weeks.
Jonathan Blake, thanks.
25 to 7. How much might we learn from the tests that were announced yesterday, the rollout of tests that will start to be used on NHS staff from next week to see if they've had the virus, as well as what we learned from yesterday's briefing about a potential new test for coronavirus? Palab Ghosh, our science correspondent, is on the line. Let's talk about the new test for the virus first of all. Palab, how is it different to what's already being used?
Well, Michelle, the
The test that's currently available is a test to see if you've got the virus at the moment. The new test, the antibody test, is a blood test which tells you if you've had the virus in the past. Now, at this stage, it's not particularly useful to individuals because if you've had the virus, there's no guarantee yet that you won't get the virus again. So if you find you've got antibodies, that's immune cells that are raised against the virus, it's useful for scientists to track the virus that's spread and getting all sorts of information about how many people in the population have got it, how many might not be displaying symptoms. But at the moment, for individuals, it's of limited use.
And yet, the fact that it is being rolled out first to NHS staff suggests that there must be some practical use about perhaps getting people who are self-isolating back to work.
Well, the key question is, does having antibodies make you immune? So people who are frontline workers are more likely to be reinfected, and so they can see that quite directly if someone has had antibodies, whether they are reinfected or not. So that will give one of the big clues. And if it's found that having antibodies does give you immunity, then that really is the game changer that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised. But at the moment, we don't know whether it's a game changer or not very useful for individuals at all.
And the other new development in terms of testing for the virus, a much quicker way of getting a result.
That's right. Now, mass testing will be absolutely critical in lifting lockdown. The idea is that rather than locking the whole of society down, you lock down new infections and those they've been in contact with. At the moment, it takes a couple of days for those results to come back. If that can be done in 20 minutes, which this new test has a potential to do, it's being trialled by the government, then that makes this track, trace and test system much more effective.
Pallab Ghosh, thank you very much, and we'll be talking to Professor John Newton, who coordinates the testing programme for the government at 7:30.
23 minutes to 7 is the time now. Let's look at the papers and the news websites, and the Mail is very excited by testing. It says hopes of getting the UK moving again have been dramatically boosting by those two testing breakthroughs that Pallab and Michelle have just been talking about. The paper welcomes the trialling of a new on-the-spot coronavirus test and the planned rollout of 10 million antibody tests from next week, asking, could this be the biggest virus hope we've had? The Daily Mirror describes the antibody test as a game changer. It'll boost understanding of the spread of the disease. It'll help vital frontline staff return to work. The Times reports on the possible introduction of immunity forms to allow people who've recovered from the coronavirus to resume more activities and be freed from social distancing. But the paper sounds a note of caution, saying it'll be months before it's known whether people who've had the virus do actually retain their immunity.
The majority of the Cabinet want Boris Johnson to embark on a major push to return the country to work next month, according to the Daily Telegraph. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak is said to be among ministers who are concerned about long-term scarring to the economy caused by the coronavirus lockdown. One tells the paper that scientists are inevitably more risk-averse and that there don't seem to have been second peaks in countries where restrictions have been relaxed.
The Guardian leads on what it says is the first major U-turn of the Boris Johnson premiership, the scrapping of the surcharge paid by NHS staff and care workers from outside the EU towards the health service. The paper says the reversal is being viewed as a victory for the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, who raised the issue on Wednesday, prompting pressure on the Prime Minister from within Conservative ranks. The Sun's leader column praises Boris Johnson, though, saying he's shown strong leadership by changing course in the midst of a fast-moving crisis.
The Financial Times highlights China's plans to impose new security laws on Hong Kong. Bypassing the territory's legislature would be a show of legal force, according to the paper, and one likely to fuel further pro-democracy protests. Opposition politicians in Hong Kong warned the South China Morning Post that the one-country, two-systems model could be nearing its end. An editorial in the state-run China Daily dismisses the criticism, saying those speaking ill of the new laws simply have an axe to grind against the Chinese mainland.
Sir Keir Starmer has written an article for the Independent website calling for an urgent package of mental health support for NHS workers and for care staff as well, including treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Sir Keir describes the impact on the nation's mental health as the hidden cost of the coronavirus crisis and urges the government to provide immediate help for people self-isolating as well as those with pre-existing mental health conditions.
And the Daily Telegraph reports that dolphins on a stretch of Australian coastline have reacted to a decline in human visitors by showering those who do stop by with gifts. In return for fish, of course, volunteers on the Kalula coast say bottles, coral and sponges are among the offerings, which are turning up 10 at a time since the closure of a popular feeding centre. Researchers quoted by the paper say the creatures probably don't miss humans per se, just the routine and a free meal.
Oh, those researchers, so unromantic. 20 to 7 is the time. Our main headline this morning is that care home providers are urging the government to introduce routine repeat testing of all residents and staff after a pilot scheme showed that most homes had at least one asymptomatic case of coronavirus.
The Director of Public Prosecutions told MPs yesterday that more than 400 people were prosecuted for coronavirus-related offences in England and Wales in April, including hundreds of assaults on police and ambulance staff, acts that Max Hill called disgraceful. Overall recorded crime in England and Wales fell in the 4 weeks before changes to the restrictions. Here's our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume.
While lots of people are out on their doorsteps each week applauding key workers, others have been behaving a bit differently. In April, 424 people were charged with more than 600 COVID-related crimes.
That comprises, I have the numbers here, 313 emergency worker assaults, 142 offences of criminal damage, 99 public order offences, 62 common assault, 44 shoplifting.
The Director of Public Prosecutions for England and Wales, Max Hill. The Justice Committee Chair, the Conservative Bob Neal, asked,
we're talking about somebody that's spitting or coughing at an emergency worker, a police officer, somebody, the ticket collector scenario we tragically heard about. Am I right in that?
Absolutely right.
Max Hill went on.
We've identified particularly appalling conduct towards emergency workers. That includes obviously police officers, ambulance personnel, nurses and other health workers. And we've moved, I think, very quickly in partnership with the police to bring those cases to justice.
But he promised justice was swift.
We're seeing a very high conviction rate, actually. It's hovering at around 97%. That is because in the vast majority we are receiving early guilty pleas. And those matters can move through to sentence.
Lockdown for some people means being effectively locked up with an abusive partner or family member. That's why, as Max Hill explained, domestic abuse cases were being given priority.
So we're as alarmed as anybody else by the very difficult position that in the main women are put in, particularly in some communities, under enforced lockdown. That represents a risk to those individuals, and it's very important that we say publicly that we are there to deal with those cases and to deal with them quickly and efficiently.
A Labour committee member, Maria Eagle, wondered,
are you actually seeing an increase in the number of cases that are outstanding as a result of COVID?
Domestic abuse makes up over 13% of the work of the prosecutors. Max Hill said there was evidence of an increase of about 3%.
In terms of those cases which have started with a call to the authorities, we are now seeing an increase, but it's quite small. I should say for domestic abuse, we know that the England-wide domestic abuse helpline saw a very sharp increase in the number of calls. I think it was placed at 49% in April. But those callers were people who very sensibly were either checking on their own account or on behalf of relatives, what do we do if things get worse?
Well, for other people of ill intent, being bad is only a few taps of the keyboard away. One of the stars of the reality show, The Only Way is Essex, Towie of course, has started a parliamentary petition to bring in new ways of identifying and stopping online trolls. It's had nearly 134,000 signatures. Bobby Norris told MPs he'd seen a big increase in abuse since lockdown, and not just against people in the public eye. Opinion was one thing, death threats quite another.
So if someone messages you, I don't like your hair today, I don't like your suit, them jeans don't look good on you. Opinions, that's fine. When something crosses into what would be illegal offline, a crime online should be the same offline.
He wanted internet service providers to block the IP or computer addresses of offenders. Simply suspending a social media account was not enough.
Because it's so easy to start a new account because no ID is necessary to get a social media account. No sooner have you blocked them, they've gone back online within 5 minutes and started another one, and they're not being held accountable. And you're forever chasing your tail because you're blocking and they're opening them literally within minutes.
Educating children about how to use social media would help in the future, but
I'm not naive enough to think, until a law's passed, that anyone's going to stop this, because for some reason trolls get fun from doing what they do.
Bobby Norris said his trolling had become so much worse because he was trying to stop their fun.
That was Susan Hume reporting on Yesterday in Parliament. Brings us to 6:45 and to time for the puzzle for the day. It's been set by Bobby Siegel, school maths teacher, author, Cambridge University doctoral student, and it is, well, 50% puzzle, 50% plug, or perhaps 60% one, 40 the other. Anyway, you decide. Monday was the start of the second BBC Two series, Monkman and Siegel's Genius Adventures. The University Challenge friends, Eric Monkman and Bobby Siegel, are exploring British inventions from 1750 to 1900. They looked at the first edition of the 1791 Encyclopaedia Britannica, which has 2,400 pages. Eric and Bobby have a reading speed of a page every 4 minutes. So how many 9 till 5 working days with an hour break will take them to complete the encyclopedia?
Now, the time is 13 minutes to 7, and care homes have said more than once that they would like to have regular coronavirus testing, but guidance seen by this programme has suggested that this might not happen. Sancha Berg, our correspondent, is on the line. What does the guidance that you've looked at say, Sancha?
Well, what it says is presently we would expect targeted repeat testing where there are outbreaks and evidence of sustained transmission. There's nothing about regular routine testing, which the care providers, as you said, have asked for. They're worried it could easily get back into a care home, brought in, for instance, by a staff member who didn't know they had it because they had no symptoms. I asked the Department for Health and Social Care about this as well, and they said repeat testing would depend on clinical advice and testing capacity.
What have we learned from the testing that has taken place?
Well, nothing's been published by the department, but I have been speaking to one of the providers who was involved in the pilot which took place over the last couple of weeks. That's MHA. And this was a pilot for whole home testing. That's testing all staff and residents in a care home at the same time. MHA have shown us the results from their testing, and what they show is that most homes had at least one person who was positive without symptoms. So out of 28 homes tested last week, 20 had at least one staff member or resident who was positive but didn't show it or know it. And another provider that I've spoken to had a very high overall rate of people who were asymptomatic and positive.
Sancha, thank you very much. And the Chief Executive of the MHA care home chain, which is the largest non-profit care provider in the UK, Sam Monaghan, is on the line now. Good morning.
Good morning, Michelle.
How much of a worry are these asymptomatic cases to you?
Hugely, because when we've been through, obviously, the period of nobody else coming into our homes, we've still seen homes having or developing cases and outbreaks. And the only real way that that could have come in and then been spread is because you've got asymptomatic staff and asymptomatic residents. And I think our figures are around 3% of those staff who've been tested who were asymptomatic have come back with positive, and about 5% of residents. And I suppose if you've got people walking around the home, interacting with others, then you're going to have that real risk of continuing to bring the infection in. And with the relaxation of some of the lockdown measures out in the community, there then could be the potential for our staff to then be more susceptible to picking up the virus and then bringing it into our homes.
So I'm sure now everyone working in the care home is operating with PPE all the time.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
But you're clearly still worried about the risk of the virus spreading.
Well, I will give you an example from just 2 weeks ago. We'd had a home where there had been no infection throughout the whole pandemic. We had a case develop, and in one of our residents, they started to show symptoms. They were tested, found to be positive, and none of the residents had been in or out of hospital. There was no other way that it could have come in, and yet none of the staff were presenting any symptoms. And at that point, it was before the whole home testing procedure was in. There was a real reluctance to test staff. They were going to test the residents, but they weren't going to test the staff. But that was the most highly likely way that the infection could have come into the home.
What would be the testing regime that you would recommend? Once a week for every resident, every member of staff?
I think what we're saying is either once a week or once a fortnight. Some of the research that seems to be done would suggest that weekly would be the most effective way. I think Professor Grassley has produced a report. He's part of SAGE, and he has come out with a report which recommends weekly, but at least fortnightly testing to ensure that we've got a rolling programme so that we can ensure that our staff and our residents, we know who has got the virus.
And just for your chain, how many people would that involve?
That would involve around 6,000 staff and around 4,500 to 5,000 residents.
I see, so that would involve testing around 10,000 people every week or every fortnight. I mean, it would probably then result in you having to, if what you're saying about the asymptomatic staff members is borne out, it would probably immediately mean that, you know, you'd have to tell some staff that they couldn't come to work and then bring in agency staff.
I mean, what we're finding is we have passed the highest point where we were seeing cases and mortality rates, and also we've got more staff now returning back to work in terms of no longer needing to be self-isolated. So earlier in April we had a real high point for both mortality and staff being off and self-isolating. That has improved. So with the test results coming back now and seeing some staff having to actually go off because they have got the infection, we are able to cover most of those with our own staff. Occasionally we will have to bring in agency.
And when you have put this to the government, is the answer you get back that the testing will come to you, but it's presented as a one-off, or in the case of outbreaks, nothing more than that?
So what we've been told at the moment is that if our staff or residents have had a negative test this first time round, they won't be tested again unless they start to display symptoms. But by then it could be too late, because you would have had other people who would have potentially had the infection and have passed that or spread that within the home. So this is a really vital tool in our armoury to really try to manage as effectively as we possibly could the ongoing infection in our homes.
And on the practicalities of it, has most of the testing so far been on the basis of home testing kits, or have people come to the home, or in case of staff, have they been tested at the drive-through centres?
The new whole home testing is where the kits are brought in, and we've still got in places where they haven't actually been tested yet, people going to the drive-in centres, or we've had public health coming in and doing those tests. The initial period of the pilot for whole home tests was a bit rocky in some places, with delays or with some tests getting lost, or with some tests coming back as inconclusive. But now, that's generally improving now.
So now, would you be happy that if you got what you wanted, weekly or fortnightly testing, would you be happy for it to be on the basis of the home testing kits?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the only thing I would say, however, is that for people with dementia, this is a very invasive process. It's not a pleasant process anyway, but the saliva test would be so much better for those with dementia because it's far less intrusive. And obviously, if you've not got capacity, that can be a real issue.
Sam Monaghan of MHA, thank you very much.
Brings it to 7 minutes to 7. An urgent appeal to the government this morning is being made on the subject of child migrants, unaccompanied children arriving on our shores and needing to be looked after, and particularly the shores of Kent. And Roger Goff is Conservative leader of Kent County Council and is on the line. Morning to you.
Good morning.
What is the problem that you're bringing to the government's attention, and what do you want done about it?
The problem we have is that as a country we've not got our processes sorted out on this. Once the children arrive in Dover, we need to have a clear response, and that's not happening. So in Kent, we're becoming the sole carer of the nation's unaccompanied children. That's not fair, it's not safe. The numbers are increasing dramatically, really back down to the levels that we saw in the crisis of 2015. Just to give you an example, we've had now almost 180 young people come into our care so far this year. That's twice the level of what we saw same time last year. In the month of May alone, it's nearly 50.
And how are they getting here?
That is getting to a point that is unsustainable.
How are they getting here?
At the moment, they are now coming on the boats. So there was a time when most of the young people who came into our care came via lorries, but it's now very much the boat route. Historically, those who came on the boats were more adults and families, but now there are unaccompanied young people on that as well.
And is it your view that the French authorities are doing enough to stop those boats from sailing and potentially to take them back when they should do?
I certainly think that we need to see every effort made by authorities on both sides of the channel to be on top of this, because certainly in the past, the British and French authorities have actually worked together very effectively. They did so particularly after the crisis of 2015. Anything that encourages or facilitates anyone, but particularly children, taking that really risky route is deeply irresponsible, and it's actually very, very damaging.
Because you'll know that Nigel Farage and others have pointed the finger at the French Navy and said that, to put it mildly, they're not at the moment doing what they should do. Do you think that's true?
Well, I'm aware there's quite a dispute, as I say, between the government and Mr. Farage over the significance of what it was that he filmed. And the government will point to the fact that French authorities actually stopped around 100 unaccompanied or asylum seekers getting on the boats in the days before that. So
you take the government's side in that argument, do you?
Sorry?
Do you take the government's side in that argument?
It's hard to say that, but I think what we can say is that at the moment, clearly, not enough is happening to stop those journeys, and more needs to be done, because at the moment what we are seeing is arrivals on a scale which, as I say, we in Kent certainly cannot cope with.
Yeah, and arrivals of children in really desperate circumstances, because not only have they been abandoned and are on their own, but also, as you said right at the start, they're in the hands of really unscrupulous people who've put them on those boats.
Yes, that's right. There is criminal activity clearly behind that. And what we are finding also, though, is that the problem that's emerging now at this end is that we are a large local authority with a lot of experience in this area, but our capacity is being overwhelmed. My Director of Children's Services, one of our most senior officers, has said to me in terms that he will need from me a direction within the next few weeks to actually go and collect those children from the port, because we will not be able to deliver a safe service and our statutory responsibilities.
Roger Goff, leader of Kent County Council, thank you very much.
Coming up to 2 minutes to 7, Sarah Keith-Lucas has the weather forecast. Morning, Sarah.
Good morning to you, Michelle. Well, we saw temperatures over the past few days up to 28 Celsius, but things are changing today. Some much cooler weather on the cards, and unsettled themes things over the next few days, and a particularly windy spell of weather to come for all of us. There is some rain in the forecast. It'll be heaviest across northern and western parts of Scotland. Elsewhere, not so much, particularly down towards the south and southeast. Things are set to stay pretty dry, certainly over the next week or so. So today, for the southeast of England and eastern England, it's a very mild, cloudy start to the day. We've got a few showers around. Most of those showers should clear away towards the east, and then it's sunny spells and scattered showers. For the southwest of England, Wales, the Midlands, northern England and Northern Ireland, a day of sunshine and heavy, potentially thundery showers. Scotland sees rain this morning, clearing to sunshine and blustery showers. Very gusty winds, particularly across the northwest of the UK.
Sarah, thanks. Tomorrow night on BBC Radio 4, we look at a strange fascination that's common to many.
Hello, I'm Steve Punt, and I'm here to talk to you about films, books and music that are bad, but therefore good. That is to say, they're good in the sense that they're bad. But being bad kind of makes them good because you enjoy their badness. You feel good about them because they're bad. Is that clear? Good. Or possibly bad. Join me and my guests, Robin Ince, Laura Snapes and Grace Dent, as we try and unravel the attraction of stuff so bad, it's good.
Dance to up, oh wait.
So bad it's good. Tomorrow night at 8 on BBC Radio 4.
And in the next hour of this programme, one overseas care worker's reaction to the news that his family will no longer have to pay the NHS surcharge.
Oh, I cannot contain my enjoyment right now. I could hug everybody right now, but 2 meters hug, yeah?
And as the latest figures on the public finances are released, we'll be talking to George Osborne.
You're listening to Today on BBC Radio 4 with Michelle Hussain.